to ask topic-specific questions after each panelist has presented. And then hopefully we'll have some time to open up and have more general discussion at the end of the session to finish the hour. So without further ado, Charlotte Lemanski is going to start. Charlotte's from the Department of Geography and will talk to us about working with local researchers on the ground during lockdowns. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Charlotte. Yeah, so I'll just start by introducing who I am and then give you a bit of an idea of what I'm going to talk about quite briefly. So I'm an academic in the Department of Geography, and my research mostly is focused on South Africa, also some research in India. Mostly I do research in very low income housing settlements, talking to people about housing and infrastructure and citizenship. And mostly I do very, very qualitative research, interviews, ethnography, working alongside people. Now, I'm sure when we think about a pandemic, the location of my research and my methods are problems. It is not possible for me to carry on traveling to low income settlements in South Africa. I mean, at the moment, travel between the UK and South Africa is completely prohibited. So it's very obvious that my research is affected in the short term and in the long term. And when I was preparing for this talk, I kind of took my mind back. Who can remember March last year? Believe it or not, in March last year, I sent a postdoc out to South Africa to do work in March, at the start of March, when we'd heard of this virus. But, you know, it was going to be fine. You know, it wasn't going to really affect us in a big way. We were just going to wash our hands a bit more. Remember those days? And my postdoc traveled out there to prepare things. She was doing some field work for me and she was preparing a workshop. I was planning to travel out there to do lots of workshops in low income areas and that she was setting up for me. Of course, you know, to cut a long story short, I had to rapidly get her on an early plane home. She very rapidly found herself locked down in a hotel room with no one wanting to speak to her unable to go anywhere, and us desperately trying to get her a flight back. So that was kind of how the pandemic affected my research and her research as well, obviously, right from the very, very start. And so I guess I just kind of wanted to get us into that headspace to remember how it felt at that time when a week, you know, it took me about 4 days to get her a flight home, but it felt like months. Every day was so stressful. And I'm sure we all remember how that felt and the panic and the uncertainty. And now it's been a year. So I want to talk about how research for me, because obviously we can only speak from our own perspective, how research for me has changed in this year, and also to think a little bit about how some of those changes aren't short term, some of those changes are perhaps long term, and what that might mean, even if we get, I don't think I want to say a post-pandemic, but perhaps I want to say in a post-crisis era, because I think we can say that we're still in a crisis. And I'm going to frame it by thinking about how my research has changed in terms of who am I working with, how am I collecting data, and what am I researching? And I think that's quite a helpful way. So I have to move my hand to be on the screen. 3 ways of thinking about, so it's who, how, and what. And I'm going to talk quite generally because I think some of the other speakers are going to talk a bit more specifically. So who? Most of my research has been shifted to working with local researchers. Now, by local, I mean people that already live in South Africa. They lived in South Africa before the pandemic and they still live in South Africa. And now some of these are people that I had already worked with, but the ways that we're working together has changed. Some of these are people that I had never worked with before. And when people talk about working with local researchers, it's a nice vague title. What does that mean? Local to who? It's very odd. And so, again, speaking from my own experience, local researchers has meant that I'm working with a wide range of people, academics based at South African universities, NGOs that work already in South Africa, and 3, people that live in the low-income settlements where I would ordinarily have gone and done research, who perhaps don't think of themselves as a researcher, think of themselves as a resident, think of themselves as a human being, as we all do, but that this label of local researcher is kind of a global north construct that we've put, that we have put onto them. So those are the people that I've ended up doing my work with and through. And most of my contact with people that live in low-income settlements has been indirect. It's quite a big deal to try and set up a Zoom conversation with someone that lives in a setting where access to electricity and access to data is quite scarce. There's also huge power dynamics of me spending quite a lot of my time communicating with people that live in low-income settlements. So most of my research is now done in a much more indirect way than I'm used to, as being someone who loves going into low-income settlements, talking to people, getting to know people, finding out more about their lives. For me, that's always been a really important part of my research, and that's gone. And even the people who are doing research, I don't want to say for me, that's the wrong language, but doing research with me, I'm not speaking to them directly. My academics in South Africa that I work with, NGOs in South Africa that I work with, I'm in contact with them, and they're in contact with people that live in low income settlements that are doing some of the research that we're collaborating on together. So that's the who am I doing research with? The next I wanted to talk about was how are we doing research when even the South African academics and NGOs aren't going into the kind of settlements where we would have ordinarily been doing research. Well, some of it's been through that old school thing called the telephone, which had really fallen out of favor prior to COVID. The thought of doing research via the telephone was not a big deal, but we've done quite a lot of phoning people and speaking to people. When I say we, not me, I'm not making those phone calls. The local NGOs and local community workers that the NGOs have employed are doing that. And by community workers or local researcher, these problematic labels, is people that live in low income settlements who have been eager to do this and who have been paid to do this and who have been trained to do this. And it's often phoning up people once a week to check in with them. Find out at first, when the lockdown in South Africa, which was very strict at first, when it first happened, it was simply phoning to check in with people. What's happening? How are you feeling? What are the major issues? How can we help? Often it was about sharing information. People were struggling with access to electricity, access to water, access to information, not knowing how they were going to pay for their next food. And we were able to connect them up with resources and information that were delivering those things, but perhaps they didn't know about. And so at first it was weekly phone calls. We did also develop some WhatsApp groups where people were asked set questions via WhatsApp and wrote their answers as a group, but they were actually not super successful. People found that very difficult. We did also give data to people, so that in South Africa, I'm sure it's possible to do it elsewhere, but I'm not a technical person. I think Alex will speak more on the technical side. We were giving data to people's mobile phones in advance so that any data that they spent speaking to us, they didn't have to pay for upfront, and the amount of data that we delivered to their phone was more than we were using in their contact with us. So in other words, it was a sort of indirect way of covering not only their costs, but a bit more, covering their time, covering their commitment. So that was that. So phone calls and to a lesser extent, digital tools, that's the how. And then going on to the what. It became very clear early in lockdown, it wouldn't be appropriate to just carry on with our research, asking people questions that are relevant to a research agenda that I wrote in sitting in my office in Cambridge, when people were going through a huge change, a lockdown. So we got permission to change the focus of the research to finding out about how people were coping, what were the challenges of lockdown. And in actual fact, by coincidence, I suppose, because my research looks at housing and infrastructure, actually a lot of the issues that emerged in that research was things that I was interested in anyway, and would have been a part of my original plan to ask about: access to energy, access to water, access to housing. But it also developed a lot more. People talked about community groups, community networks that were springing up in the lockdown setting that wouldn't have been something that ordinarily I perhaps would have asked about. But because we were shifting the way we were doing research to try and find out what is your agenda, what is happening in your life, rather than being led by, well, I've got funding to look at energy access. And obviously that's the only question I can ask you about. It flipped the nature of the research. And we've talked about flipped classroom in the pandemic, but this was kind of a flipped research. So that's what I wanted to say about who am I working with, how am I doing research, and what are we researching as a team, to think about how my research has changed working in low income settings. And then I guess I just wanted to draw together at the end by maybe raising more questions than I can answer, which is about, it's forced me to think in the last year and to talk to my collaborators about the ethics of this new way of doing research and the kind of flip between, am I exploiting and kind of driving almost a colonial way of doing research, where I, sitting in my very messy spare room in Cambridge, is kind of paying people and asking people to do things. Is that kind of a colonial exploitation? Or actually, have we flipped things to an extent that actually the research has become less about me, much less about me, and that's a good thing? And that local researchers, rather than money being spent on flying me over to South Africa, that's a huge amount of money. My flights, my car hire, my accommodation, all of that money has been repurposed to paying local researchers to collect data, get involved in the project. Of course, what's important going ahead is that they're not just seen as kind of data miners, but that it's really important that those people are part of how we write up the research, how we analyze the research, that we don't just kind of see them as people that were paid to just collect data. So for me, it's challenging how I do research. And even though I've always been committed to ethics and a post-colonial agenda, if I'm fully honest, I feel quite sad at the thought that I won't be able to travel to South Africa as much, totally selfishly, because it's something that I've always loved so much about geographical research, is meeting people and getting to know people. And if a pandemic has forced me to reevaluate how I do my research, and I think that's important and I think that's right, it's still sad for me to think that I might have to, you know, take away some of the bits of the research that I really, really love. That's what I wanted to say. So it was structured as who, how, what, and then raising a few issues and questions at the end about ethics and exploitation and what it means for how we might do research in low income settings over there in the future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that. Was really, really interesting. I'm going to open up for maybe sort of a few minutes of just specific questions, if anyone has any for Charlotte based on her presentation. Just unmute yourself and talk. You do. Or the chat, I suppose, if people don't feel comfortable talking or their data is not good enough, you can write a question in the chat, of course. I've just opened the chat up on my computer.
Hi, I had a question for you. I'm running Milnesi. I'm a program manager, so I'm on the logistics side of things. And I've only really been a program manager through a pandemic, which has been rather strange. So we haven't met as a team, and we now won't. So yes, I agree with you that it's amazing what you can do as a distance, and we've also been able to work a lot closely and build bigger local teams, which has been great, and more funding can go there. But I'd be interested to know how far you think that could go. Like in future, would you, I presume you'd still want to travel at least once within a project, but how, like what balance do you think that would take?
I think it's really early days to know exactly how we're going to rebalance things. I think what it's done for me is I'm less involved in all sorts of things that are happening on the ground. And whilst as a bit of a control freak, that of course I find that hard, it's actually released some of the, again, using this language, local researchers to be more confident, to take ownership of the project, to feel they don't have to check back in with me about things all the time. They don't have to show me things. I'm not there. I can't see it. I can't know about everything and everything that's going on. So that's been actually a positive. But yes, going forward, I do still, you know, proposals that I will put forward in the future, I would still hope to be able to travel, but perhaps to rethink what's the purpose of that travel. Am I going to check in on what people have done? No, that's not my role. Am I going for them? You know, I'm the learner, they're the expert, and I'm going there to find out new things and to be exposed to things. So it's forcing me to rethink and to challenge. I don't think I have answers for you about how it's going to go. But I did have, you didn't ask this question, but I was thinking about what it must be like to be, you know, setting up a brand new project and managing a new project. And some of the people that are now working on my projects I've never met, which is new for me, but it's almost like a devolved thing where the academics in South Africa I'm working with, I already had great relationships with. The NGOs we're working with, those South African academics had good relationships with. The people we're working with in low income communities, the NGOs have good relationships with. So it's kind of, it's a ricochet effect down that I normally would have been much more involved with. And some of that is about trust, but it's also about communication, open communication, saying, people saying to me, look, we're not quite sure, is this working, is that working? And trying to cultivate a relationship where people feel that they're able to share their problems and ask questions, I find is more challenging online than in person. But it's easier if you already had a pre-existing relationship with the team, of which I have with some of them, but not all of them.
Yeah, thank you, it's interesting.
Valerio, I think you had your hand up next. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Charlotte. That was very helpful. I just have a brief question, if it makes sense, just following up what you just said now about, you know, how you already have some relationships with people on the ground. In my case, for example, if I won't be able to go and do my fieldwork in person, I don't necessarily have a specific kind of like relationships with researcher at my similar stage that would be able to go out and do research for me. So I was thinking, just out of thinking out loud, one possible way to establish such relationship with another researcher to do some kind of research for me, and I'm doing research in Italy, could be to go through perhaps some academics I know in Italy and ask if they know someone that could do such research for me. But in that case, I guess, because it will be in a similar position as me, that would kind of be like their thesis work as well in a way. So I'm just a little bit confused in terms of how would you, if you had any like specific advice or tip on how to establish some relationships and what kind of people to look for on the ground through the research.
I think first, I think I just want to acknowledge and validate that it is harder if you're starting in a new setting that you haven't worked in before, and to acknowledge my privilege in that I've already worked in South Africa for the last 15 years. And that is, not to take that for granted and to assume that the fact that I've been able to set these things up relatively quickly is feasible for everyone. So I guess I want to say, that it is different if you're new to a setting. I think it is legitimate in the current context to be trying to find someone to do fieldwork for you, if you like, although that's always tricky language. I don't think we always have the right words anymore, the right language within methodology for how things are changing. The way I would recommend to find someone or people to do data collection for you is through local institutions, whether it's at universities, whether it's NGOs, and to go through trusted institutions and networks and ask if there are people that they would recommend. And then as much as possible to do training with the person about what do you want from the data? What do you mean by ethical data collection? What do you mean by qualitative methods, or whatever it is in your case, and to be able to spend as much time as possible speaking to them and training them in what's appropriate. But I would recommend going through trusted academic or NGO institutions in the context where you're hoping to work. I hope that answers. There's a question in the chat. Should I go for that?
I think so. And then I might move on to Alex and then come back to other questions at the very end.
Yeah. So Sarah Davies, for those that can't see the chat, Sarah Davies says that she's doing social conservation research in Zambia at a distance, but wants to know how you find respondents at a distance without being able to do household surveys. And that sort of speaks a little bit to what I was saying in response to Valerio, which is that it isn't possible to do household surveys from a distance without some form of intermediary. And I guess there's questions there about how do you identify intermediaries, and then how do you communicate with them, and how does your relationship with them evolve? And I guess it's the same thing where I'd really recommend reaching out to local, like I said, universities, NGOs, community groups, finding out who's on the ground and who's recommended, and then trying to work through them. So it isn't going to be a direct researcher household surveys. There's going to be at least 1 or 2 or 3 tiers of intermediaries in between, and recognizing that, and then thinking about how you communicate and train in that context, I think is what's really important. I hope that answers.
Great. So I'm now going to move on to Alex Cullen, who is also from the Department of Geography, who's going to talk to us a bit more about the use of ICT and technology in remote research methods.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. I'll just share a screen. I know Charlotte did just such a wonderful job without one, and PowerPoint makes everything worse, but it might just help at least with my talk. Oh, we have to turn on participant screen sharing. Oops, is that working?
Yep, we can see slides.
The right slides? Yep, good. Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. We should all be used to a few hiccups, and these sort of hiccups are the sort of things that I'll sort of talk about a little bit too. So moving on a little bit from, I guess, what Charlotte was talking about, I'll raise a couple of these issues too, which I think are so important for discussions going forward around methodologies, particularly in remote, but also look at a particular kind of methodology that might be appropriate for some of you. And it's been quite useful for me in the past. So a little bit about myself. I'm a lecturer in the geography department, and a lot of my work has tended to look at, I guess, customary land rights and land conflicts around resource management, usually in Southeast Asia. So I've done a lot of my work in East Timor and also Papua New Guinea. And what I'll be speaking to you today is less a method that I use as much with my research, which tends to be very ethnographic, very qualitative based, spending a long time in the field, and looking at some of the survey work that I've done in the past as well, where we've been looking at land use around conservation mechanisms that have been introduced, and also sort of conflict and livelihood issues. And the particular one that we're going to look at is, I guess, the power of mobile phones and internet communication technologies, so ICTs. I'll just briefly run you through, I guess, one of the methods that I've used in terms of collecting some survey data, as well as some of the pitfalls and possibilities that occur with this program. And then, I guess, really sort of dig down into some of those challenges and considerations for employing this sort of method, which obviously looks like a fantastic opportunity given, you know, the limitations we have in terms of remote research at the moment, but comes with a heavy amount of baggage. So ICT or mobile surveys are really easy to use now. They're really easy to program. They're much more accessible than they used to be for a researcher who doesn't necessarily have a tech background like myself, who's a bit clunky. Basically, the way that this can work is through any particular sort of smart mobile device, even iPads or tablets. Really cheap Android phones are fantastic for this. You can use that in order to actually input particularly survey data in the best way possible. That then gets sent up to a data cloud, and you, perhaps back remotely, are able to see that data come in, or at least see it collected through an open platform. There's a wide variety of tools in which mobile surveys are now done. Very, very professional products that are out there. Kobo Toolbox has been one that's been quite important for, I guess, the design of these particular sort of tools and particular methods that go along with it. A lot of this has come out of the aid development and even conservation arenas. In particular, the one that I've used has been ODK, so Open Data Smart Kit. Some of you, if you've worked in conservation, I guess, might be more familiar with spatial monitoring and reporting tool like SMART, but there's a litany of other tools out there, a lot of them free and open. ODK in itself is an open tool, and it's been around for a while, which is why I've used it myself. There's different formats for it, so there's a very, very complex version, but in general, it's quite programmable in terms of how it can be set up. It's easy to use on an Android device, a really, really cheap one, which is why it's also good, and it's open source, which is fantastic. One of the interesting things about ODK as well is it's been well introduced into this tool called Kobo Toolbox, which is kind of like an online platform or an online toolbox in which you can take the data that's sort of sent there through systems like ODK, and it gives you some analysis or at least some visualization. And it's good for monitoring as you, I guess, as you see the data come in. Now, one of the great things about ODK, particularly considering some of the communities that I work within, is that a lot of sites in East Timor and Papua New Guinea where I've worked don't even have reliable mobile signals or cell towers. They drop out a lot. And what's great about this is it actually works without that. Once the survey is loaded into the system, you can record as many as you want, and automatically, when you get back into range, it will just upload them, which is really good, really simple, makes things a lot easier in that regard. One of the key things you can do as well is have a program language selection. So this means that you can even on each and every question kind of flip between languages. Really, really helpful, particularly when you're working in an environment such as Papua New Guinea, where there are 300 plus languages. Plus also there is Pidgin as well as English that is used sometimes. Being able to sort of change between them for the enumerators can be really, really helpful in terms of clarification. But alongside that, it's got some great features which makes use of smartphones such as GPS, photo, timestamps. You can incorporate these into your data gathering with something like a survey. It's also really useful in that you can incorporate pictures. So you can imagine having to show some of your surveyees a certain question, and you can clarify that with a picture representation perhaps. As I mentioned, it's compatible with a visualization platform, and that automatic upload is really, really beneficial, particularly in terms of data entry. This requires some attention to detail in terms of some cleaning, but not having to actually enter data from your paper surveys is really, really helpful in terms of time, but also in terms of security. Particularly not having, I was working with the the Department of the Environment in Papua New Guinea, and they had stacks of surveys sitting in boxes going moldy from different regions, which hadn't properly been even like inputted yet because they didn't have the labor to do it. Oops. So in terms of building a survey, there's different ways you can do this, and if this is something that's appealing for you, I encourage you to explore the different ways this can be done. There's a much more easy, friendly to use way, which is around using an online tool, ODK Build Online, but you can also learn to script and test the particular survey often through Excel. One of the things that I've done as well in the past is when we've, I guess, accelerated some of our research or brought it up to a new level, I was partnering with an organization who helped build a final product to contain and also handle the actual survey that we were working with. Obviously, if you don't have money or funding for that, that's not necessarily something you could do, but this was part of a larger, broader project. And in that way, we had something that was really functional and usable. This is just a quick example of what this sort of scripting looks like. So I have a very, very poor understanding of computer programming, but yet I was able to pick this up and learn how to code it. There's instructions online. It takes a little bit of investment, but it's certainly something that you can do. I found it really, really rewarding in terms of being able to construct and test a really, what I thought was quite a fantastic and sensitive survey to the needs that we were looking for. And you can sort of see, if you look on the right, there's some translations, I guess, in terms of the way you can flip between those different categories. So with the surveys, it does allow all your typical question types, particularly around multiple choice, or what's really quite good is a conditionality and collapsible type questioning in terms of surveys, particularly so you're not taking up too much time. So you can have open questions in which certain sort of answers can be given. This will, of course, be determined upon whether you want to do a comparative analysis across select ones, or you want to have open data in terms of analysis. But what I see is really sort of valuable here as well is opportunities for thinking, I don't know, a little outside the box in terms of photo capture and GPS, along with the actual survey. So this means, you could even structure into your questions, please ask this particular question, and then take a photo of the sanitation conditions or of the particular location that you're in. There's numerous different sort of question types that come into that. It's the same sort of rules though around and complexities of survey questions, and the pitfalls that exist in normal delivery, of course, exist here. They're just made more fraught by the problem that you're actually quite remote. Again, what's really interesting here, I think, is if you can work to try and design some of the surveys to complement some of the tools that already exist within the smartphone. So this means that you can even incorporate these into the actual survey, or this can complement and contribute to the actual survey outcomes, such as looking for your enumerators to do video diaries and record and upload those, whether that's about what they're actually seeing and experiencing, or even how they think, you know, the data collection process is going and how it might be changed or adapted. It's really interesting. You can think of doing transect walks where you can't do that, but you can have an enumerator actually walk with video across and through a landscape in order to get a visual sense. If you have an amazing relationship with your enumerator and they do more in-depth interviews, that could obviously be recorded, as well as being added into certain sort of GIS and GPS sort of toolkits in terms of getting some of that spatial data. In terms of designing your questions, I won't go into this too much, but there's obviously difficulties that come with this in terms of working remotely. One of the key things to be very aware of with this is it's fantastic how much information you can get, but actually typing onto a phone can take a really, really, really long time. If you want that complexity of data, you need open questions, you need typing, but that can add a huge amount of time in terms of the actual survey, as well as, you know, limitations that might be on your surveyees. There's other implications as well, of course, around leading questions, as well as the breadth of your survey pool. But the key issue here, which I guess we'll get into a little bit more, is that particularly when you are not on the ground, I mean, you do this when you're on the ground anyway, but testing and consulting and testing and consulting and testing again is just so important, particularly when this is done remotely. And this means it's a long process in terms of actually coming up with this when it's done remotely. Garbage data in will produce garbage data out, and that comes when you haven't tested properly or done adequate consultation. Now, there's still nonetheless some key concerns around some inaccessibility, particularly around like contribution and consultation in terms of the design of the survey. The survey is actually going to be only successful if you have a long consultative process with stakeholders and with enumerators and with participants that you're going to use. It's really important there's ownership that's demonstrated in terms of that survey, and that requires input from everybody in that regard. There's key concerns as well around literacy, whether that's being able to actually, of course, read, but also digital literacy in this regard. And that limits who's able to participate. Training is required, and piloting, this is another really long time, particularly exacerbated by remoteness. This needs to occur a number of times in my experience. And enumerator bias can be quite frequent here. As I mentioned, the more complex the survey, the more messy the data gets. So it's I like to think that it's really important to try and get this right, which means a lot of training, a lot of testing before you see this sort of being put out. And one of the other issues around that is because it's difficult to adapt and change on the fly. You might find a question all of a sudden doesn't work in a particular community, and there's a particular reason for that. It's not exactly easy to immediately just change everything. It requires quite a bit of time. There's also issues around costs for your local enumerators, whether that's data or phone, or even in certain areas around energy, where I've been in certain areas where there hasn't been electricity, or the electricity is often out. What I'm getting to though is, and these are issues obviously Charlotte's already touched upon, ICT, although it gives us great power in terms of doing things remotely, it doesn't solve socio-political challenges, particularly in terms of data capture. Power and positionality are more important than ever, as well as thinking through issues around surveillance. So this means that the considerations for your research project, for the communities obviously that you want to work in, or the landscapes you want to be in, require that extra bit of time of consultation, as well as consideration for what the achievements are looking to be. You need to think critically around training and the training type and the way that would occur, which is incredibly hard to do, obviously, over something like Zoom. Another key issue, I think, which is really important here is around surveys and data ownership, like who owns the data. And I like to think that you can usually try to at least communicate that data back to the communities that you work with, if that is something that they want. How you do this through particularly a survey remotely is something to really think about. So you need to really think about how and who benefits from this particular process, particularly if you want them to have a stake in it. Another issue which I'll just briefly mention, because I know I'm probably going on a little bit too long, is the politics and complexities of Indigenous local knowledge and how that's incorporated into digital forms. Not just in terms of it being able to fit into certain sort of digital libraries or the idea of that being kind of categorized, but also the politics of that. And in terms of a particular sacredness or power of certain sort of knowledges and a lack of that wanting to be communicated. So I guess in this regard, like it's really powerful, but doing this, obviously, as some of the questions have already raised, is never going to be as easy as you think. And that's because everything is determined upon the relationships that you build. And I think as people have already questioned, how do you build those relationships when you're starting remotely? I've been very lucky in terms of, I've been working in these particular sites like Charlotte for quite a long time and have built up those relationships. And that works as a way, I guess, of mediating some of the complexities that now exist in terms of having to be remote from this. I've also, like Charlotte, escalated, I think, the say in terms of how research is built and what we decide to research. The complexity of management and good practice is amplified by remoteness. And that means that this needs to be more consultative, but also collaborative than it's ever been, I think. This is really, really hard to do. And I can speak more about this if there's questions, but it's complex. And I've just been very lucky in terms of having people already on the ground where a system has been in place. And we've done a lot of training around that where we still have data coming in. Lastly, I guess I'll quickly say that, obviously, some of the key benefits are that this can be delivered remotely. There's different languages and accessibility and transmission. But really what's important here is, I think, a real benefit of the situation is rethinking your research, relationship and ownership. I mean, the questions really need to be asked about how you should make this more collaborative, how often you will be check-in and present. I mean, really thinking through those particular research colonial practices. Are you a captain or are you a co-pilot here? Are you helping to steer the ship? You know, you're being reflective and giving support to the real researchers on the ground. And how is this information going to be communicated back to your participants? I think so often research is extractive, and it is incredibly important for that to be delivered back in a particular way that is established beforehand, before it's undertaken. Thanks for your patience. Happy to not take questions to the end, seeing as I've gone on a bit long.
I was going to say, if anyone has any immediate questions for Alex, we could probably go for maybe a few minutes just on questions before we talk to Lucy. I can't see any hands up. I've got a question, but I can save that for the end, Alex. So if not, then...
There are questions in the chat. I'm not sure who they're for, but there are questions in the chat.
Missed them. Is this Sarah again? Sarah's got a question, if you can read that, Alex. She says, what do you think about the possibility of increased accuracy of responses through phone, online surveys? Here in Zambia, we're asking sensitive questions about legal behaviour, and now through phone surveys seem to be getting more honest responses due to the remote nature of surveys.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, like I don't think there's any hard and fast answer here. I mean, I will say there's an interesting benefit that comes from the particular remoteness. I mean, we're not all on the ground sometimes when we do have enumerator teams working with our enumerators, but it's interesting to see how different that relationship is struck with enumerators when you don't have a white person following you around. There's different sort of elements of, I don't know, collaboration that can even occur between participants and enumerators in different sort of ways in terms of ownership. around what's important for communicating. I'm sorry I don't really have a proper answer for that, but I think it's important that we see the certain opportunities that come out of the particular situation that we're in, and look to, you know, expand and explore those as best possible. So I think that's interesting, Sarah.
Can I just say one thing on that? I think, just backing up what Alex said, what's important is when we shift our methods to remote, not to assume that they're just the same by a different, people are still going to respond in the exact same way. It just happens to have been remote. You know, we need to recognize it's different, and there's positives and negatives to that, and that's okay. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. So I'm now going to move us on to hear from Lucy, who's a PhD student in the departments of land economy and geography, and she's just going to talk about her use of remote methods and some general sort of insights into, I guess, how she's found the process of moving her work online.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, both Charlotte actually, and also to Alex. I want to say at the beginning that I'm doing a longer session on the actual practical nature on the 30th of April of my new methods. So we'll actually go through a worked example if anyone wants to attend that. But for this talk, I'm going to talk more about my personal perspective based on a CCI opinion piece of doing your fieldwork remotely as a PhD student. So I'm in my third year, and I was interrupted just before I was supposed to go on my main kind of data collection trip to India. So I had to rehash my whole PhD quite late on in the process. And there's two ways I think that being a PhD student maybe makes you different to what Charlotte and Alex have already talked about. So the first way is that you might feel quite uncomfortable using research assistants because the PhD is supposed to be your own work. And even if it's legitimate to use research assistants, still you might miss out on those solo papers that could really build your academic career. So that's a consideration. The second thing that I want to mention is that even if you're a natural scientist or you're a social scientist, the PhD is often when you consolidate that network of relationships upon which you build your career. So that physical presence, building trust with people, building your network of contacts. This might be the most secure funding that you ever get as an academic at the beginning of your career to actually develop that body of kind of content that you might use for further research. So I think that's two things that you kind of miss out on if you're a PhD student in this particular period. So my own research is on the contested debates around sustainable development, and I'm using large dams as an example of development infrastructure around where this controversy sits. I look at why you can get two reasonable people really disagree about the same dam. So one might say that we need large dams to mitigate future climate change by being able to, release water when we need it in drought-prone areas, be able to generate energy in response to intermittent supply from wind and solar. And then you can get someone else like talk about how this might be mindless development, how you can actually create disasters by building large dams, such as the disaster that happened earlier this month in Uttarakhand in India, where a constructed dam was being washed away by a huge amount of debris, which might have also, that particular debris and water might have been released because of climate change. So I look at this kind of contested debates, which means that I need to have lots of structured conversations with people about disasters, about why people disagree. So it's a very conversational PhD that I'm doing, so I need to talk to people and therefore access them, which has been obviously a challenge. So that's what I do, but I wanted to, like Charlotte, also talk about why I wanted to do this in the first place. So I'm very interested in the topic, and I'm very motivated to contribute in some meaningful way to a more kind of equitable future for the world. I wrote my PhD proposal after visiting the Aral Desert, which was once the Aral Sea, where there were some really poor decisions made around water politically. However, I have to be really frank, I did my PhD because I wanted to travel to the Himalayas. I wanted to go camping, I wanted to go hiking, I wanted to meet people. Like Charlotte said, I'm fascinated with conversations that you can have with people from different places. That's why I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And that's what I'm actually grappling with most when I come to kind of confront what remote methods is all about. My whole career, even prior to my PhD, was about trying to get someone to pay me to do the things that I enjoy, and that includes travel. And I've been in the lucky position to spend 3 years living in a tent in the forest, and I've visited 25 countries for work since 2008. But now I can't travel. It's really made me question the legitimacy of the work that I've done in the past and my own personal carbon footprint. So I once went to the Philippines for a conference for just 3 days. I went to Japan for 2 days. I went to South Korea for 5 days to attend the Convention on Biological Diversity. I don't like to reflect on this, but I'm now forced to, that can I actually justify flying for these conferences? Now, I've actually found it really easy to network with people online. And while, you don't have that coffee break session, you can just, be proactive, reach out to people who you think are interesting, who are speaking at conferences. And I do think that moving forward, I hope that we do try and fix this quite broken system. And most uncomfortable of all, what I've had to confront is that I do have this latent Orientalism, which could be a very ugly post-colonial attitude towards romanticizing travel without questioning why it's okay for me to go to a country that I've never been to before, where I didn't grow up, and think I could contribute in some kind of meaningful way to some of the more fundamental things which are happening there, when I'm never going to capture the kind of consequences of this infrastructure, whether or not it's being built. So that's something that I've really, really grappled with. But now I am more than 4,800 miles from my nearest field site, and I need to complete my PhD in these circumstances, so I've had to adapt. So I've been using an online Q method survey, which is a systematic way of looking at subjective opinions on large dams. In my study, I present my participants with 37 statements on large dams and ask them to reflect and rank them in the order of which they agree with them. And this has actually been a really big win for me, because the consultants who work on large dams and on dam planning and assessment are very mobile people. They live all over the world. It's very difficult to track them down in person. So having the survey online, I've kind of created a virtual table that I can take all around the world and create a discussion over that table. And it's been a really good way to structure these conversations. It's been less awkward than it might have been to have an open-ended kind of Skype discussion with these people. And because of the pandemic, everyone's available and no one's questioning why I'm reaching out to them online rather than trying to go and physically meet them themselves. So in some ways, I've kind of been given the permission to try and reach out to some of these people. However, I also want to talk about the negatives of doing this. So I think that good social science research, like Alex and Charlotte have said, is about listening and creating knowledge with people rather than about people. I hope we've moved on from that kind of way of working. And while there've always been language and logistical reasons why it might be harder to access all people, particularly the politically marginalized, online, this has turned into a deafening silence from people who don't have devices, physical and social access to the internet. I don't even know what I don't know, and I'll never probably find out what I'm missing from the way that I'm going about my work. And when I'm using political ecology as a framework, when I look at who wins and who loses from different environmental changes, this is a really legitimate criticism that I'm going to have to face up to in my viva and, the legitimacy of my research going forward. There's also something less tangible that I feel that I've lost, and that's the lived experience of being in the same landscape as the infrastructure that I'm researching. So Hayden Lorimer in the 2016 transaction piece talks about this as the kind of small stories of fieldwork, with the kind of conversations that you have, the inferences that you make just from being present. Now, if I've got time, I'm going to share one of those kind of small stories from one of my pilot trips that I took while I was in Delhi. So I was very heavily pregnant towards the end of my last pilot trip, and I'd been advised not to go to Delhi because it was going to be very polluted, it was going to be really problematic for my high-risk pregnancy. But I had to go anyway to have some meetings. I had to go in to fly in and out. And while I was waiting on a kind of metro train station platform, I saw this huge cloud of pollution traveling towards me and kind of enveloping the whole train station. And I couldn't actually see the buildings opposite me anymore because it was just so thick, the smog that I was in. And I had this kind of sense of kind of rising panic. I was like, gosh, I'm just going to stop breathing for this moment. But actually, I couldn't stop breathing. And I was thinking and reflecting on this, in that if I'd been a displaced person who'd been displaced by a large dam, I'd have been given a financial compensation payment to kind of relocate potentially to an urban area. But could that financial compensation really kind of compensate me for this panic that I was having, for these health implications I had from being moved? So I'm not saying that I understand everything about what it's like to be a displaced person, but that's the kind of insight that I think you kind of miss out on completely if you're not actually going to travel anymore. And while I'm talking about babies, I wanted to mention maybe an unexpected bonus of this past year. So I had been expecting to take my 7-month-old baby with me last year in March with my mother-in-law, which has its own challenges, to India to complete my fieldwork. But that was going to triple my fieldwork costs, and there was no clear way in which I was going to have those compensated. I was also, after my maternity leave finished for a month, when I should have been like reflecting and thinking about what I was going to do for my interviews. Instead, I was like Googling, how do I express breast milk on like a Delhi train? And this kind of mental burden was relieved when I realized that I couldn't actually go anywhere. So it has been a leveler with my childless PhD cohort, even if it's not what I wanted. You know, I wanted to take my baby, I wanted to go, but at least I haven't suffered as much as I might have otherwise done had I been trying to manage two things at once. And the other thing I should say, which I think is often an assumption that's made about mothers and children and academia, is that you can just take your baby with you and that's going to be fine. And you're going to be there with your headscarf and your little sling and it's all going to be beautiful and wonderful. But actually, that does then take the child away from its other parents. So I've actually had a bonus in that my son has actually spent all of the months of his life with both me and my husband, which I think is a positive about the pandemic as well. So what I wanted to conclude with is that all is not lost. You know, I've had to challenge some of my entrenched assumptions about research, reconfigure about how, when I think travel is necessary and when it's not. And I really think that conference travel is not necessary. I really do think if we want to have an equal kind of academic platform for all different people, then you should think about parents and fieldwork very seriously. But I have been able to kind of reconfigure what I'm doing. But I should conclude to say that this isn't the lifestyle that I wanted. I didn't want to do a desk-based PhD. I wouldn't have chosen to do this. So that's one of the things that I've really had to challenge myself with. And I think that Charlotte was mentioning that towards the end of her talk as well. But if this is like the worst thing that's happened to me, that I haven't got my like lifestyle, then I'm really quite fortunate in this pandemic, which is ultimately a health crisis. So that's it from me. Please do reach out to me one-to-one because I'm looking for feedback on this as a CCI blog. And yeah, it's a lonely place to be. So just like, do feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. That was really interesting to hear, I guess, the perspective of a PhD student, and I think one that a lot of us can empathise with. We are moving towards the end of the hour, so Alex has had to shoot off, but I think Lucy can definitely stay on for a bit of more of a general discussion, and Charlotte, if you're free for another few minutes, if we want to open up to sort of general discussions. I know a few people had questions. So let's open it up, and if anyone has anything that they want to raise about anything to do with remote research, or any specific questions for Lucy or Charlotte, that would please go ahead and ask those or put them in the chat. And I won't be offended if you have to leave at the hour as well. There was a question, yeah, Abhisheka. Did you have a question for Charlotte?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a question, but I just wanted to share the problems I faced with my research back in India. So, I mean, if somebody has some kind of advice, I'll be happy. So I do work. I mean, I did work for a local research organization in India, and my study site again is a place where I kind of belong to. I speak the local language, so it's easy to assume that because I'm from the region, I could just go and do my work. And I had to do a bit of recce survey to kind of build up my project proposal. But the problem I faced was because, again, I came from a big city, the local communities were not open to interacting with me because they were scared that I might be carrying the virus and spreading it in the village. So I had to cut short my journey and return back to the city. So yeah, I mean, this is just my experience. And because when I go back to India next year, I need to really think about how do I approach the local communities again.
I think that's really legitimate. And one of the things that it raises is all sorts of assumptions in the binaries that we have with this language of local researcher that I kind of highlighted a bit in my talk, that there's a bit of an assumption that local researchers are separate. They're not interconnected with, what am I, an unlocal researcher? I mean, the linguistics just doesn't make any sense. It didn't make sense before the pandemic, but it's become even more highlighted that every researcher faces challenges in different ways, in different countries, in different contexts. Some of that's to do with the way that different countries are responding to the pandemic. I mean, I love Lucy also being honest and talking about the challenges as both pregnant and then as a an academic parent, which is the same for me. And I share a lot of those experiences and challenges that Lucy talked about. And I think it's really important to talk about them as well and to make them something explicit rather than to sort of pretend that we don't have personal challenges that are part of our identity as researchers, as academics. That's great. Thank you for sharing.
I had a question, Charlotte, for Charlotte or Lucy, just off the back of the last one, which was sort of about, I guess, sort of when do we know when it's right to go back into the field? Obviously, our government might say, yes, we're allowed to travel now, but how do we know that sort of the participants on the ground are ready to receive researchers again? And how could we, I guess, sort of manage those tensions?
I think Charlotte Milbank, I should say, and also Charlotte Lemanski, because obviously being in charge of ethics. I think, Charlotte, you highlighted at the beginning when we had these like one-to-one discussions about the ethics of spreading the virus. And I think it's really important not to go back into the field when there's a risk that you could do that, when there's a risk that you could be traveling to remote areas, bringing it from urban centres, bringing new variants from Britain. I don't think that that's ethically acceptable. So I think that should be, it's not the answer to your question, but I think that's a really important consideration. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go, but obviously there are questions of being able to isolate, being vaccinated, that should be considered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all really important. It's where personal ethics, as opposed to project ethics, if you like, comes into play. And yes, we take government advice. Yes, we take advice from local researchers, that phrase again. We also look at our own personal situation. And I think one thing that I think is really important to recognise is that two people won't be able to make the same decision about when it's the right time to go and do fieldwork. And I think we need to be really cognizant of that and really understanding that everyone has very, very different personal and institutional settings that will affect when it is or it isn't appropriate. Even two people going to the same field site will have different vulnerabilities and different logistics. And I think we need to be sensitive to that. And I think it's a case-by-case scenario. I mean, of course, for me working in South Africa, it's not looking optimistic at all in the near future. So that's completely off my radar, but that's because just so happens that the country that I work in has had a particular strain emerge. And the country that I live in has as well.
I have a solution, or partly a solution to working in fieldwork settings and the ethics of COVID and stuff. Should I speak now? Or?
Yeah, go for it, Teresa. So Teresa's a postdoc. She works in South Africa quite a lot. She's at Cambridge.
Hello, I'm actually in Cape Town.
You are. I thought that you were, but I didn't want to say it. I thought it's for you to say where you are, Teresa.
Yeah. So the way that I've got around it, so talking about people being worried about you infecting them. So I'm working, my research setting is with a church and a congregation there. So the whole project has been put on pause because we're not allowed to congregate. So we're sort of guided by the rules, but the workaround is if you're going to a context where people are going for a different reason. So if I go, so I did interviews for the first time last week, and I was able to do that or ethically sort of make that decision because I'm in a setting where people are anyway, they're not going to speak to me, they're going because they're going to church. And then I'm speaking to them in that space. We're all social distanced and they're adhering to protocols. So I don't think to myself, gosh, I'm putting them in a position, they're in the position already. Also, it helps that it's summer. So we can talk outside and there's all of those things. So like you've said, it is context specific, but there are workarounds. And also I think what you were saying about COVID, meaning that you can ask different questions. So rather than saying I've got funding for X, so my project is a thing on plastic, but actually I don't want to say the nice thing about COVID, the
unintended outcome.
The unintended outcome is that then I'm less bound by those sort of funding constraints or things that I had in the proposal, because I can just play the COVID card and say, actually, we just talk generally and everyone will understand. It feels like people are much more understanding you can have that flexibility, which is so important for building relationships, being flexible, not being rigid. And it's like, oh, I'd love to talk more, but, you know, sorry, I only want to talk, you know what I mean? So there are some opportunities for more flexibility in building relationships. Yeah.
It was nice to see you, Teresa.
I feel so bad about the sunshine.
I actually have to head off fairly soon for another
meeting. I can't see any more hands or messages in the chat, so I might just wrap up this session, given that we're over time. So thank you to Charlotte, Lucy, and Alex, who's now gone, for generating such an interesting conversation. It's certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's given a lot of others things to think about how we move forward, not just during the pandemic, but also sort of moving on post, as Charlotte said, post crises. Howard has recorded the session, so I think this will be available to listen back to on the UCCRI website. And I believe we've also got a series of blog posts written by Alex and Charlotte from a series that we did over the summer in the department. So I can circulate those as well if anyone wants any extra reading on this. But thank you for attending, and it was lovely to see so many of you here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for organising. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks.
Thanks, Charlotte.